Welcome back to the Bulletproof Fantasy Football Podcast. Here today, we have none other than Edwin, the injury doc, FB injury doc on Twitter, possibly the best injury doc on Twitter. It's unconfirmed, but it's probable, I would say. Certainly not questionable, probable.
I appreciate that, man. I appreciate that. It means a lot. I appreciate you having me on, getting to talk a little bit of process, a little bit of Dynasty. I'm excited. I think you have one of the most, the funniest names on Twitter. I DFB counter, right? Is that what is it? DFB count, bean counter. Moral of the story, yeah. Bean counter has always, it's such a funny term to me, such a funny phrase. So every time I see your name come up on my timeline, I smile just a little bit because it's a funny phrase. But I'm excited, man.
Because I'm an accountant. You knew that, right?
Yes, I think I knew that. I somehow, some way, or across the Twitter spheres, I knew that. You're dressed like an accountant. I can tell. I'm dressed like a scrub. So
yeah. No, the last couple episodes, I've been on vacation. I've been working, so I had like the Hawaiian shirt. I had the like vacation hat on. I was just getting obliterated in the YouTube comments of how bad I looked. Everyone wanted the suit back. I'm back to work, so now the suit's back. So
you set an expectation, man.
Yeah, right. So other places you can find Edwin. He's got a podcast. It is the Injury Prone Fantasy Football Podcast. He is a part of fantasypoints.com, one of my personal favorite websites. So check him out on that. But let's dive into something that has been a hot topic in the Patreon the last few weeks. Sony Michel. So like your whole thing is injuries, right? Sony Michel's whole thing is he's been injured, but he's been playing, which is interesting. What's the deal with Sony Michel? He's ever going to recover and be what he once was? Is he basically toast at this point? What are you doing with Sony Michel?
Yeah, I think the thing with Sony Michel, I think if I remember correctly, I honestly, to be 100% transparent, haven't looked into this myself, but I think his efficiency was a little better last year. Yards per carry is a very non-sticky, not great stat. But if you do look at his yards per carry, as I am right now, I just lost it. I had it. Yards per attempt. Yeah, it was 5.7 last year. So, I mean, I know, like I said, it's not the best stat in the world, but if you look at it from a relative perspective, he went from 4.5 and then 3.7, jumped back up to 5.7. So, I mean, his efficiency improved to a certain degree. There are a lot of factors that go into that, obviously, but it's not so much that Sony Michel himself is injury prone. It's the fact that he's had so many procedures to his foot and to his knee. He was on COVID list last year. He's had all of these specific performance cappers, these ceiling cappers. For example, inside the knee joint surgeries. He's had an ACL surgery. He had fluid drained from the knee at one point. I think he had a scope at another point. So he's had all these ceiling cappers that directly zap juice and burst. So it's really unfortunate. It's not so much that he's going to be injured or that he's going to be injury prone, or, he could suffer at some point some inflammation in the knee because he's had so many issues with that knee already. The risk with Sony Michel is that he falls off a cliff in a very similar manner that Todd Gurley did. Like, we could see him vanish at any point because of the inside the knee issues that he's had. He's heading into his 27-year-old season. That's not great, obviously. So all of these factors that are playing against Sony Michel, I know the offense, being into the new offense doesn't impact running backs quite as much, but I mean, that is something. I saw a blurb that he was still learning the offense. I misspoke. He's actually heading into his 26-year-old season. So Sony Michel, I think at this point, from a performance perspective and from an injury perspective, he is what he is. Like, he's shown us who he's going to be. He played 13 games as a rookie, 16 games in 2019. Without COVID, he probably would have ended up playing a handful more than 9. So he would have played probably about 11, 12 games. He, like I said, has had these performance zapping injuries, and he is at a risk to fall off a cliff at any point. But the Rams didn't care because the Rams hate draft picks. And so the Rams went to go get him. At this point, you can probably, you could see him taking at least some of the value away from Darrell Henderson. So I don't know. I kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, this is completely out of my wheelhouse. I'm buying him because he has been a good player in the past. He has pedigree. The Rams traded for him when they didn't have to. It's not like he was a free agent. They were just like, yeah, we'll just sign you because we need someone. They're like, no, we can see what's on the free agent market. And they're like, yeah, we'll ship off some draft picks. I get that it was the Rams. They don't like draft picks, but it's still something. Like they could have just signed a free agent if they really felt like they needed one. They didn't. They went and traded for Sony Michel. And then if you look at last year's like advanced metrics, like beyond yards per carry, Sony Michel was pretty good at that too. Last year, he was pretty bad in 2019. and he was really, really good as a rookie.
Which
and
makes you wonder what happened in
he was also really good.
Yeah. It makes you wonder what happened in 2019, and if that's more of a blip on the radar than it is, the norm. So I think he's good. Like, he's a good running back, right? I think that he's somebody that can contribute. If you need like an RB2, if you went 0 RB, whatever, hero RB, I think that he's someone that can contribute, but he does come with a little bit of an asterisk that he's had so many inside the knee issues, foot issues, that he's at risk to, like I said, just fall off the cliff. That's not to say that we're predicting that, but as long as you know you're taking on that risk with Sony Michel and it's commensurate with what you're willing in terms of draft capital to use on him and fab to use on him, then I'm totally fine with you. Yeah, definitely rostering Sony Michel.
Yeah, it really comes down to cost. Like, I'm not gonna, sell the farm to go and get Sony Michel, but he was going for like 4th round picks basically in Dynasty prior to the trade, and I think if you acted quick right after the trade, you probably could have got him for a 3rd here and there. And I'd have been into that because I don't think Darrell Henderson is anything more than a guy. And if Sony Michel is also a guy, and I think he might be a little bit more than a guy, then it's like, well, I'll just take the guy going 6 rounds later,
Yeah, I totally get that. No, I totally get that. But yeah, that's the deal on Sony Michel. I'm not like super concerned about him. I'm also not super thrilled. I think he's one of those unsexy picks that can get something done for you.
Totally. So did the Rams just not care about knee injuries? Like they went with Todd Gurley when they knew he had a torn ACL, and I think there was a lot of rumor that he was going to have future knee problems at that point, didn't they?
The thing with Todd Gurley is this probably was brewing. It probably didn't come out of left field, but he spent his entire career with the Rams before he got, before he left the Rams, obviously. So it was probably something that was brewing. Who knows if in medicals what it looked like? It's something like 20 or 25% of college prospects come in, have radiographic evidence of osteoarthritis in a joint, any given joint. It's common. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to predict arthritis. Gurley was just one of the unfortunate ones who got early onset arthritis, and it impacted his performance. It was something he couldn't dig himself out of a hole from. But yeah, I don't know. The Rams, I would assume they did their due diligence. I don't know. I don't even remember what they ended up spending on Sony Michel specifically, but I did think it was ironic that the one running back they went after is at the same amount of risk for the Todd Gurley syndrome to happen to. Like, I thought that was rather, I guess they're just risk it for the biscuit. I don't know, but it was a little ironic to me.
Yeah, right. Like, it's like, it was like such a predictable Rams move. It's like, yeah, they traded draft picks. Of course they traded draft picks. That's what they do. Yeah, they got a running back with a bad knee because of course they got a running back with a bad knee. That's what they do.
The Rams are just like, I'm such a conundrum. Like, I find myself wondering, is Sean McVay actually sharp? Like, are the Rams sharp? Sometimes you're like, yeah, the Rams are sharp. And other times you're like, what are you doing? Like, I'm in a constant conundrum of like wondering if they make good decisions. And sometimes they just don't.
I think that like every front office and coaching staff has like these hot streaks where they just like, flipped heads 3 times in a row. And we were like, oh my God, look at what they did. Like they're geniuses.
Right.
It was just dumb luck. Like
it could be
like the next week, they're like 3 tails in a row. And you're like, whoa, like what's going on here?
Right.
That's the Rams right now. Like, honestly, the Kyle Shanahan thing with him being like this god tier coach that nobody is Kyle Shanahan. He's the greatest we've ever seen, right? And then you look at like his offenses over his career, and it's like, well, he's actually ran a lot of really bad offenses over his career.
Right.
It's not like he's always had a top tier offense like Andy Reid. Like,
right, exactly.
It's bizarre how he is coined this.
He's a little bit of a legacy, a little bit of a legacy guy. He's good enough to keep a job on top of his dad being who his dad is. So, it's, nepotism is alive and well in the NFL. We see that every day.
For sure. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of Edwin process. So you have, if I recall correctly, been ranting and raving on the Twitter sphere about how injury prone is not a thing. So what is injury prone and why isn't it a thing? And what is a thing? Like, how do you, like, if injury prone isn't a thing, how does injury analysis help us?
Yeah, good question. So that phrase is specifically for the random Twitter egg, or the guy with 18 followers and a dog for an Avi and following 500. That person is always screaming in everybody's mentions how this person's an injury prone player, that guy's injury prone, this guy's injury prone. Oh, he's injury prone, he's been injury prone since 2012. You'll see if you go through their history, because I've actually unfortunately done this, they'll say, oh, this person had a concussion, they're injury prone. And then they'll turn around a month later after that player has something totally unrelated, like a groin strain, and they'll say, see, I told you that person's injury prone. And that's really, when I say injury prone is a lie, that's the type of attitude and mentality that I'm referring to. What it comes down to is, as fantasy players, fantasy managers, as the sports med community, we are not as good at predicting injuries as we like to think. If there was an injury prediction algorithm or machine, there would be some doc or PT or PhD guy, lady out there making a ton of money. But ACLs, for example, are one of the most notorious injuries that we have. We know that there's some data and evidence to say, if you do X, Y, and Z, which is totally irrelevant to this podcast, but if you do X, Y, and Z with your athletes, you prepare them in this way, strengthen here, work on motor control there, you're going to decrease their chance of injury. But it's actually only a very small amount. Like those same players who go through that program, they still tear ACLs too. Why? Because humans aren't robots and machines. We don't know. There are so many contextual factors that go into injury. So what I try to do is bring in the context that matters. Try to apply context to injuries that are unrelated. For example, something like I said, a groin strain, a concussion, an ankle sprain, something like what Keenan Allen had when he tore his ACL, ruptured his spleen, and then broke his collarbone. Those are totally unrelated issues that were very unlikely to occur again. And then we've seen Keenan Allen be healthy up until last year, right? So it's one of those things that as fantasy managers, we need to take the proper context and apply risk specifically, which is what I try to do with my tiers every year. And what Ethan Turner, for example, another physical therapist, tries to do with his injury score with prospects coming out. This is all relative. Yes, certain players are at risk for more injury than others, but no, that doesn't mean that it's completely predictable. And if you can identify the players who are at objective risk, a higher objective risk than their peers, then that is an advantage in Dynasty. And that is the advantage that the top 5% of players are constantly looking for. I have blue check marks in my DMs like all the time. And they might never say it. They might never tell anybody, but they're constantly asking me injury questions, right? Weekly. What does this guy look like? Hey, can I pick your brain here? Hey, can I pick your brain there? Honestly, I should start charging these dudes. But anyway, the moral of the story, big picture, is that injuries are relative. Injury histories matter, and not everybody's injury prone.
Gotcha. So I have a question for you. I heard this on a podcast. I don't know. It must have been 2, 3, 4 years ago. And it stuck with me. And it was talking about, I think it was like insurance and like car insurance. Like if somebody gets in a car accident, they're way more likely to get into another car accident. And it may not have even been their fault. And they were likening it to injuries. It was like, well, those drivers are maybe just a little bit too aggressive, or they're not paying quite enough attention. So that will show up again and again. And that's why the insurance rates go up on people that get in a car accident. And they're relating it to football injuries. And they're like, well, that player doesn't quite protect his body in the same manner as maybe another player might. Does that factor in at all, or is that not a thing?
I wouldn't say that's accurate. I think you can maybe take that into account a little bit, but it's so not quantifiable. Like, it's so random. There's so much entropy in the game. I mean, a good way to think about it is like film grinders who they can all watch one play from the same player on the same day on the same drive, and they'll all tell you 10 different reasons why that player is good or sucks, right? Like, it's very subjective. The same thing goes with the quote unquote style of play argument. I mean, yeah, if a quarterback's running straight into a 300-pound linebacker, a D end, a 300-pound D tackle, yeah, that's objectively a bad decision, but that's called bad decision making. That's not called, style of play. Like, these players, for example, running backs, you can cluster them into the types of injuries that they have. Running backs most often injure hamstrings, shoulders, and ankles, right? So those are the 3 types of injuries. And then you look at quarterbacks. By a disproportionate amount, quarterbacks injure their shoulders. Why? Because they get sacked in the pocket. They get AC joint separations. They try to scramble, land on the tip of their shoulder. Receivers, hamstrings are really common in concussions in receivers and tight ends, because they're constantly laying out over the middle. They get concussions more frequently in some cases than running backs. So it all depends, and it all depends on positional demands and physical demands in addition to their history. Like, what I'm trying to say is, I don't want to sound douchey. I don't know if I can cuss on this podcast. I don't want to sound like a jerk and make myself, self-aggrandizing, saying like, oh, it's so much more complicated. Let me explain it to you. But it really is a lot more complicated than we're making it. It's sort of like, and the last thing I'll say, because you got me on a rant now. Damn it, Drew, you got me on a rant. So the last thing that I'll say It's not gonna be the last thing I'm gonna say. Let's be honest. This isn't a study done from 2010 to 2014. You might have already seen the statistic I'm about to say. Do you know, in that span of time, do you recall what percentage of games were considered injury free? And that definition is by definition no injuries were reported to the athletic trainer or to the team doc.
I have no idea.
4 years of data
zero
is 2.3%. Once you bump that number, once you adjust for the dudes who reduced their own finger back in, who put their own shoulder back in, who saw stars and didn't say anything, that number is probably zero once you adjust, right? Yeah. Everybody gets injured. So to scream that this person, X person, Y person is injury prone, you cast a wide enough net, eventually you're going to be right. So it's not, for example, it's not groundbreaking to say, oh, you should avoid Saquon Barkley because he's going to get a hamstring strain. Like, without that ACL, he might have gotten a hamstring strain anyway. You have no idea. Like, you're just casting a wide enough net and throwing a stone, and you're probably going to like be right more times than not. I follow injury analysts who will help sharpen my process and will, for example, challenge me on, well, I actually don't think that this is going to be a problem because of this, this, and this. And that is, you want to look for the injury analysts who are not alarmists, and you want to look for the injury analysts who will give you context and nuance and help you understand what your risk really is and walk away with a true understanding of what this quantitative risk is, understanding that there's randomness and this is never going to be 100%.
That's funny. I feel like you're like preaching to the choir a little bit from like the data side, where people are like, well, he wasn't good because of this one thing, this one data point, or he was good because of this one data. I'm like, maybe, but we have no way to say that's the data point that made him not good at football. Like, there's no way that we can say that definitively is the reason.
Right. Exactly.
And I feel like that's exactly what you're saying. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, guys that, whatever, get this injury. And it's like, well, I mean, sometimes, sure. Like,
right.
Guys get that injury.
Exactly. And that's one way to look at it too is, okay, let's say that I told you Tyreek Hill is going to have a hamstring strain this year. Tyreek Hill has a history of dealing with hamstring tightness at least, right? And then he goes out and gets a hamstring strain. Maybe it was on the complete opposite leg than it was in the first place, right? And I'm telling you how right I was and telling you that I was correct, when in reality, we know the faster wide receivers are, the more likely they are to have a hamstring strain. The faster a human is, the more likely they are to have it. It's actually a really interesting phenomenon. But wide receivers are very, very likely to get hamstring strains compared to their peers. The faster they are, the more likely that is to happen. And when you're starting and stopping and decelerating all the time, like, yeah, you're probably going to get a hamstring strain at some point. So yeah, man, it just depends on the context you're applying and how, like, there are a lot of injury, and I don't want to say a lot. There are a handful of injury analysts that I feel like are very, they're alarmists, and in a lot of ways are very self-righteous and like an I told you so type of way that I'm not very keen on. I try not to victory lap when players are injured in the first place. And that's really what I want to stay away from. I want to give you context. I want to give you nuance. I don't want to just say, yeah, this player's going to get injured. Like, if I think a player's going to get injured or is suffering from some sort of injury, or their history is relevant, I'm gonna try to explain that to you. But the moral of the story is that not everybody's injury prone, and it's actually very, very rare that I would consider any player, quote unquote, injury prone. Like, I can think of maybe two off the top of my head, and other than that, everybody else, it's all on a scale.
Who are they?
You're never gonna get that out of my brain. I'm never gonna say it. Next question. I'm just here. You thought you were going to catch me slipping. Nope. Next question.
All right. So when we're playing Dynasty, we are often looking for buying opportunities, right? We want discounted players. Injuries is one of the best discounts we can find. What are the injuries that you would actually buy low on? If somebody has an injury, they get discounted. Which ones are you buying? Which injuries, not players?
Yes. Like, good question. So again, context and nuance, right? MCL sprains in the third week of a player coming back from it, knowing there's a Schefter report that says they'll be back in 4 to 6 weeks, knowing that it's week 4 or 5, knowing that because the time to hit isn't the week before they're going to play, right? The time to try to send an offer is the week or two before they're going to actually play. So I would say week 4 or 5 is the weeks, the sweet spot for somebody like Nick Chubb in 2020, where you send that offer where the owner's getting frustrated, they're getting impatient. They might think to themselves, "Is this guy ever going to come back?" You're patient, you send them a low ball offer, they accept it. I did that in a couple of leagues on Nick Chubb last year. It worked out beautifully for me. MCL sprains tend to do really well. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. Clinically, what I've observed with my patients who are not, a lot of times are not athletes, I'll put it that way. Their MCL sprains can last a long time. Like they take a long time to recover from these issues, but these athletes tend to do really well after them. So that's the first one. The other one would be, and this is also another one, applied proper context. After 3 weeks of an AC joint sprain is when I would go after a player. For example, in 2019, this is an anti-example. In 2019, James Conner came back. I think it was in the 3rd week after an AC separation. I was not going to go after James Conner. I want them to be, if it's a grade 2, and we know it's pretty much confirmed a grade 2, something like what Christian McCaffrey suffered, something like what Justin Jefferson suffered recently. I want to know that they have at least 3 weeks under their belt of recovery. For whatever reason, that tends to be the clinical sweet spot for these NFL players. And then if they're going to be out week 4, I'm sending a trade-off for week 4. So those 2 injuries are the types that I specifically go after.
All right. Good to know. That's going to be a bit of a cheat code. What about for like Dynasty? Like a guy misses a season with an injury. Which injuries do you think are worth buying in a Dynasty context where you're like, I'll get that guy next year because he's going to be great next year and he's free now?
Honestly, what I've observed too, and I'm going to be 100% transparent, it's only been within like the year and a half, 2 years that I've gone more into Dynasty. And what I've observed Dynasty players, is they tend to be a lot more sharp than your typical redraft league. They tend to be on top of these things. So it's actually kind of difficult to find because they know they're all already playing the long game. When you're in redraft, everybody is in win now mode. Everybody is in win this week mode, right? So when you're in a group of players, your selection bias is already, everybody's going to wait on it anyway. I think that the one injury that comes to mind that specifically players will generally consensus shy away from is the Achilles injury, which rightfully so. I'm leaning more so with Cam Akers. I'm going to try to acquire Cam Akers now at his floor. I'm going to assume his ceiling is 80 to 85% of what we thought it could have been at max before the injury. And I think I'll probably take that. Like I'd be happy with that. Another injury that I think people hyperventilate about a little bit, specifically for the star players, is an ACL. Even if it's people hear it wasn't just like the famous line is like, it wasn't just an ACL, it was an ACL. And we know that the literature shows that the MCL and the LCL, the collateral ligaments, don't really impact recovery one way or the other. So it's not really that big of a deal. And as long as the meniscus isn't, tore up the way it wasn't for Saquon Barkley, then they tend to recover okay as well. So ACLs are probably the second one that I would say players discount way too often, way too frequently.
Well, now this brings up 2 new questions. So here's my first question. I was going to sneak it in later, but we're going to do it now. It's on the show sheet. So you're going like completely freestyle off script here.
Let's do it.
There's been 3 22-year-old bulletproof running backs out for the season: Cam Akers, J.K. Dobbins, and Travis Etienne. Which one is worth buying? You already mentioned Akers, but is he the one to go after, or should we? Now you just mentioned it's not just an ACL, and that's the J.K. Dobbins thing. He didn't just have an ACL, and I was freaking out because I saw somebody on Twitter saying it might be a 2-year injury, and it's like, what happened to his knee? Did it fall? Did his leg fall off?
What did happen? Because to be 100% honest, once they're off, once they're off the radar and redraft, once we get into redraft time, I sort of just lose track of what these guys, and then I pick back up again in January, February. Gotcha. Did you see what his specific injury was, for example?
No, nobody can. I've never seen it. I've just seen people say it's more than an ACL, and then I saw somebody tweet that it's probably a 2-year injury. And I have no idea who it was, or if they're reputable, or if they're an alarmist, as you said. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this frigging guy in Dynasty now. Like, I bumped him way down the rankings. So, like, if it's a 2-year injury, like we're talking about, he's going back at 24. You mean, like, will he ever be the same? Like,
I don't really. Tore his ACL in the left knee. Typically, they'll report that as soon as it comes out. I think what people, let's see here. An MRI confirmed Sunday the stud running back suffered a torn ACL. NFL's Tom Pelissero reported Dobbins is looking at 12 months recovery to be ready for the 2022 season, but will miss 2021. The running back did not suffer any MCL or PCL damage. So it's likely that he had a very similar injury to what Barkley had. So that's probably what we're looking at. Yeah, there's no reason to not. I guess, yeah, that's the answer. I didn't know people were hyperventilating about the J.K. Dobbins injury.
Oh yeah, no, we were all hyperventilating.
He might have had a pretty good meniscus tear, but he's going to have a full calendar year to recover. Like, he's probably going to be ready to roll more so than Barkley is this year. So yeah, I guess that's the answer. I guess we lucked into the answer, like NFL organizations luck into good decisions sometimes.
Sounds great. Perfect. And now I've forgotten the second question that was a result of our past the past comments. So we'll come back to it, I guess, if I can remember. So which injuries are you just like staying away? Or sorry, you said Achilles is the one you're staying away from, right? Aside from Cam Akers.
If context is important. I'm trying to summarize this quickly because there's so much context to it. The Achilles specifically, it's important to look at the data. Yes, it's important to look at the return to sport data and understand that the population that the data reflects is not Cam Akers. Yes, that's very important to understand. But the science and the medical science behind it is also just as important. Even though it doesn't reflect the population that Akers is in, it's a reflection of the fact that the tendon is not a ligament. That sounds very obvious, but it's true. Ligaments connect bones, tendons connect muscle to bone. That's a very important detail to keep in mind, because what the tendon does is, we're going to get really nerdy here. The tendon translates force from the muscle through the joint to create force and power. The way that it does that is with very specific collagen fibers that are organized, tightly packed, nice and neat. When you rupture those, regardless if you get surgical repairs or if you manage them conservatively with rehab, they are never the same. They get fatty infiltrates, the collagens are disrupted. You get a very, very less efficient power translation through the muscle, to the tendon, through the joint. That is why people and players lose their ability to cut. They lose their burst. You're never the same after an Achilles injury. All of that being said, if this was going to happen to anybody, we wanted it to happen to somebody that was in his specific position to test it out. Like, this is going to be a legitimate case study. What is he going to look like when he comes back? And you also have to look at it from a longevity standpoint. I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly. Michel, who tore his Achilles. He was one of the most relevant fantasy running backs. He came back, never reached his ceiling. And then it's important to remember, he burned out. The second year after the Achilles, he burned out. So that is something to monitor, is the longevity with Akers coming off. Like, I don't want to make it seem like he's a screaming value, because there is pretty tangible and objective risk that comes with him.
Gotcha. So I have a question, and again, this is not on the show sheet, but you're just like bringing it to my mind with all your comments. When people are doing these like return to play studies, how do they control for the quality of the player? Because I just like exactly what you're saying is, I'm like, well, yes, Cam Akers isn't compared to any of these guys. So then I'm like, well, can't we just go to the medicine and say player or people generally recover 85%? Right, what you call it.
So there's a specific study that looked at power rating, right? And what they did is essentially looked at their NFL statistics. They took their touchdowns, their yards, their receptions, everything. I don't know if they took I need to go back and look at that power formula. I don't know if they looked at snaps played. They did look at games played and incorporated that. And they came out with this nice little formula that they went back and did an analysis on, and they found that it was statistically valid. And so that's what they used. So basically they used offensive production and compared it to previous offensive production. And that's what they used. It's not perfect. It's not perfect, but it's really difficult to do a study like that, because the population would dry up really quickly if we did a matched study doing that. And it's retrospective too. So that makes it even more difficult.
Yeah. The problem I have with that, I think, is that most players, unless they're really good, have really bad production the next year. Like this is kind of the thing we were talking about earlier, where it's like, well, that's the reason. It's like, no, that guy probably just sucked. That might be the reason.
No, yeah, and that's the injury
can help. But
that's the other thing about the population, is that the population was the people who tore their ACL in that study, their average age was 28. So we know that the average age of players who are going to retire is pretty close to 28 at that point. So that's another confounding factor. But that's why I think it's important to, again, consider the medical science. Like, what would be the plausible mechanism behind what the data is showing? And the plausible mechanism is that dudes can't cut and have a no burst after that. And it could be both, right? And they're 28 years old. They're going to fizzle out of the league soon anyway, right? So it could just be the cherry on top. It can be that independently. So it's hard to say, right? But I do think that to some extent, they're such large scale studies. I think there are about 11 since 2009 that they've done. The data is pretty clear. Like regardless of what the population is, at the very least, we cannot confidently say players can return from an Achilles tear. And we know that clinically because PTs like me and PTs who work with these athletes one-on-one every day, they'll tell you that clinically too. Like, yeah, guy was never the same after that. So that matters, right? And that type of context matters. So what I'm saying is it's not safe to assume that because the data is flawed and because the method is flawed, that the conclusion is incorrect. Like we aren't allowed, the data doesn't allow us to say, oh, that's an incorrect conclusion, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. I agree. I'm not arguing the premise that Achilles injuries are bad. I'm just like I said, that player may have just washed out regardless. He may, 100%. If he never tore his ACL or his Achilles, he probably would have washed out anyway because he wasn't a good player.
Right.
And no, the players peak at like, I don't know, the bad players peak at like their second year. And then in their third, if they're not good after the second year, usually the third year, they're like toast.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's like, well, a lot of those guys in all these studies that I keep seeing are like guys that I probably would have said are probably on the way down anyway. So the fact that they lost production the following year, it just makes sense. And then it's like, well, was it the injury or was it just they're not good? And I think when you fall back on we have information on these injuries across the entire world. And it's not just NFL players that tear the Achilles. So we fall back on that and we're like, yeah, well, the general person loses or never regains 75%, or they only regain 75% of their abilities. It's like, well, yeah, okay, probably the NFL players might gain more than that, but probably not 100%.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah,
I think that's completely fair. Okay, so which rookies are you following all over yourself to draft in Dynasty this year? Who's your favorite rookie?
Oh man, this is so chalk. Like I don't really have any. I know this was a pretty decent class. Obviously not 2020, but I really like Terrace Marshall. I've liked him a lot more recently. And then obviously I'm also going to go chalk with Elijah Moore. I've been sending offers for Elijah Moore before week 1 for like a week now. I've just been throwing trade offers across all my leagues. So those are the two dudes that I'm looking at. I know it's a little chalky, but man, I love the chalk sometimes.
Nah, I mean, a lot of folks didn't like Terrace Marshall that much, and I think that was a mistake. And a lot of folks said that Elijah Moore is a slot receiver, and he's never going to be anything more than that. And I think he's maybe going to be more than that. We don't know. And I'm excited for Elijah Moore. We'll see.
Dude, I will take the Elijah Moore prototype as a slot receiver any day. If you told me, I know this isn't the perfect example, right? But this is sort of like my thought process from a very high level. If you told me Antonio Brown, if you told me Julio Jones was only ever going to play the slot again, I'd probably still draft it. Julio Jones if he was only going to play in the slot. So bet on players, not situation or presumptions.
Totally. All right. So who when we're looking at the rookie class, I presume that you do some injury analysis around the rookie class. Who's the rookie that nobody thinks or nobody's like equating injury risk with that they should be?
I kind of wonder how much of a risk the general population and dynasty communities understand they're taking on with Trey Sermon. Sermon is a guy who had a really high. Why are you laughing? Do they not? I don't know.
No, you're absolutely. Nobody seems to care.
Okay,
it's absurd.
Okay, and so it's again, it's not so much that you're going to predict injuries. It's not that we're predicting injuries, but I mean, Trey Sermon has had he had in high school as a senior a lumbar fracture, and that's a bone injury. Obviously, falls into the general category of connective tissue. Then he also had an LCL rupture. Those are super uncommon injuries. He completely ruptured the lateral collateral ligament in his knee, and then he had the nasty, gruesome posterior sternoclavicular joint dislocation that we presume that's what it was in the national championship. It's the same injury that Tyreek Hill had in 2019, I believe it was. Those don't necessarily recur on their own as standalones, and they aren't necessarily a big issue standalone. But when you zoom out and you consider that they're all connective tissue injuries and that he just hasn't been able to stay on the field without an injury in quite some time, you do start looking at the data, and then you apply the context that, well, players that miss fewer than 3 or 4 games in college are the ones who tend to stay healthy in the NFL and vice versa, which is why Will Fuller is such a conundrum. Will Fuller didn't miss a game the last 2 years at Notre Dame. But you look at college availability and it correlates as the best that we can to NFL availability. And yeah, Sermon pops. Sermon's got a little bit of a high injury risk. And it's not that he can't stay healthy, because we've seen a lot of younger players prove that they can stay healthy. I'd mentioned Keenan Allen earlier. But it's something that Dynasty players should at least be aware of, that he's not a slam dunk ready to pick. It's actually really eerie that Trey Sermon and Raheem Mostert, I sort of picture them as like the Spider-Man gif, the two Spider-Mans looking at each other, because Mostert is just like, from an injury perspective, strictly speaking from an injury perspective, Mostert is like the mirror image, like the older brother of Trey Sermon. Like they can only connective tissue injuries. They can't stay on the field. They both obviously play the same position. Like they have all of these similarities from a sort of functional injury perspective, that it's kind of weird that the Niners drafted Sermon. So yeah, I guess he's a guy that most people should not necessarily assume is just risk-free.
No, it's funny. I feel like Trey Sermon, like people are just completely blind to Trey Sermon because he got drafted by Kyle Shanahan. And it's like, well,
right,
he's injured a lot. That's a problem. He never broke out in college because he was injured a lot.
Right.
And
right.
even when he did play, he wasn't really that good until that like 2 week stretch in his final year when he was, how old is he? 20. He was a regular senior, I guess, normal 22-year-old senior. Mm-hmm. And then people are like, Javonte Williams isn't that good because he runs a 4.6 or whatever. And it's like, Trey Sermon runs a 4.6. What are we talking about here?
Are people saying that?
Some people are like, he doesn't have a high ceiling, I guess is what they're saying.
No.
And it's just like Trey Sermon is red flag after red flag after red flag, but got drafted by Kyle Shanahan. So like, first round pick. He's a first round pick. Draft him in the first round. It's like, this is crazy.
Yeah,
absolutely crazy.
I like Trey Sermon from like this year. Like I was actually thinking about this when I was going over the script. I like Trey Sermon this year because this year we're full of hope. Maybe he can buck the injury trend, and maybe he is productive in that backfield because we know the 49ers, love to hand the ball off to anybody who will breathe back there. So maybe he can, squeak out a year and you got an RB2 in the, whatever it was, like the 6th round or the fifth or 6th round or whatever. Like maybe that's what happens this year. But if he comes in, he's average, doesn't have a true breakout, suffers a high ankle sprain, then an AC joint separation, I'm probably going to be out next year if that happens on Trey Sermon. Totally.
Yeah, there's just a lot of paths that Trey Sermon can disappoint, and I feel like people aren't really being aware of them.
Right.
Okay, so I need to ask you, because there's one player that I have been absolutely going to the mats for. My dude, Joe Burrow, not on the script, totally off
I've seen you be excited about Joe Burrow.
he's gonna be fine, right?
He's going to be fine. Middle of the season, he'll be fine. The thing about Burrow is this was a catastrophic injury for Burrow. He had ACL.
Whoa. You told me if it's more than an ACL, that's okay.
Let me finish. It was catastrophic for this reason. It was ACL, it was likely capsular, and it was meniscus. Those three combinations, the two major ligaments, ACL, PCL, on top of it was probably a bigger meniscus issue than Barkley had. Maybe not, right? Because he's back at 9 months. Maybe not. But it sounded like it was a pretty severe injury, right? And so for a quarterback, it's very different because he doesn't have to stop and turn on a dime the way a running back does. So he can come back and play and be okay. And we also know there are massive epidemiological studies done on ACL tears, and went from a financial perspective and a functional perspective and a performance perspective, quarterbacks aren't affected by ACL injuries very often. The thing that we were worried about with Burrow was the timeline, because 9 months is cutting it really, really close. Like for example, Carson Wentz, when he tore his ACL, the following year he came back and played. But he missed the first 2 weeks of the season. He came back around 9 months and 11 days. So, the timeline was a little tight, but it looks like he's going to make it. Give him a few weeks to get his sea legs under him. The hope is that they do, a lot of quick slants, 3-step drops, dump offs to hopefully Joe Mixon. And on top of that, I didn't know this. I did a podcast with Rich Rebar last night. He said that the Bengals last year before his injury, they ran the most plays from an empty set than any other team in the NFL, which was a really intriguing thing to find out, considering how bad their offensive line is, to not have somebody back there blocking for him. So I'm wondering and I'm curious if that number is going to dip this year, or if they're going to have an extra back, somebody to protect him back there, if they're going to do a lot more under the center, or even like shotgun formation as opposed to empty. So what I'm saying here is the ceiling on Burrow in the first 3 or 4 weeks, you should temper your expectations. He might not hit ceiling the first few weeks, but yeah, going down into the middle of the season, the last quarter of the season, you should probably see a fully healthy and ready to roll Joe Burrow.
So what you're saying is Joe Burrow league winner.
Yes, that's what I knew.
Just a paraphrase.
Put it in quotes. I want that to be the quote. Joe Burrow league winner in week 1.
The show. Edwin says Joe Burrow league winner.
Exactly.
Paraphrase.
Exactly.
Okay, so another of my favorites. He is been getting questioned in camp from a knee-biting head coach. DeAndre Swift. Are we in trouble with DeAndre Swift with this groin thing? Is DeAndre Swift injury prone? Like I've been hearing, he's been nicked up all through college. Never missed games, but he's been nicked up. Are we worried about DeAndre Swift in either seasonal or dynasty?
I wouldn't say worried. I would say, and again, another conversation I have, Rich Rebar's so like sharp. He just brings out the best in me. Like, I think we settled on the fact that if you got DeAndre Swift in the 3rd or 4th, I think that was fine. Like, I think given the entire circumstances, it's okay to not have a hot take, right? Like, it's okay for an ADP to not be egregious, or for an ADP to be, that's ridiculous, right? Like, it's okay for an ADP to just be, probably about where it should be. For whatever reason, he was going the 3rd or 4th. He doesn't come risk-free. In 2018, he had groin surgery. In 2020, he was on the injury report with a hip, quote unquote, hip injury that was likely a groin injury. Oftentimes we see those intertwined. Teams will either say hip because it's a whole region, or they'll actually put groin on there. And then in 2021, obviously he was on the injury report today, but he practiced in full. It's not so much that you're concerned about him today. It's you're wondering why these have become chronic and if it's going to pop up again. So that's your first concern. The second concern is the fact that he had a concussion with severe symptoms last year. He ended up missing 3 games because of the concussion. I think it was 2 or 3. And he had severe symptoms. Once you have 1 concussion, you're almost at a double risk to 2 times the risk to get a second concussion, especially within the first calendar year. So that's the other thing. And if he had severe symptoms the first time, there's a chance, clinically speaking, there's a decent chance he'll have, or he could have, severe symptoms the second time. So then you look at those 2 things. On top of all that, the coaching staff is aware of this. They signed Jamal Williams, who's a good little back in his own right? He's decent. He does things just well enough to stay on the field. And so you wonder, is this an intentional signing? Did they say Swift saw too many touches last year? He was injured. He's banged up. Now it's 2021. He's dealing with his groin issue again. He had the concussion. We're going to mitigate his touches. We're going to maybe take away something at the goal line from him. We're going to take away, things that are not between the 20s. It just makes you wonder. And I feel like a lot of times on fantasy Twitter, we create these narratives and sort of reach for these long-reaching narratives that we're really just using them to make ourselves feel better. But when it comes to Swift, I think there are actual objective, tangible flags, whatever color you want to make them, yellow, red, whatever, that make you go, I don't know if I would, in any other world, I don't know if I would spend a 1st-round pick on this specific guy. But that's where I'm at with DeAndre Swift. I think his ADP was, it's fine, right? I think it's fine. But I'm not concerned, if that makes sense.
So let me put it to you this way. If Christian McCaffrey had this injury history, would we be panicking?
I don't know about but I think if this was Christian McCaffrey last year and we were in the same position, I would likely be saying Alvin Kamara and then consider Christian McCaffrey, or even consider Dalvin Cook.
It is a concern, just specifically these injuries, Swift. You're telling me that I need to burn the boats, trade DeAndre Swift.
I'm not telling you that. No. I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you, like, he could we can look back in a year and be like, oh, okay, he's fine. But right now, as it sits right now, like, his specific history doesn't allow us to do that yet. Next year, if he gets over it, then he's over it. And I think he'll be over it and it'll be fine. But this year, you're sort of hoping that he does get over it. But for me, he's on my list of like prove it guys so far. And I want him to prove it to me in 2021.
All right. So I have a question for you.
Yes. That's why I'm here.
Touche. When did DeAndre Swift have his his concussion? And is there a possibility that we could get through the calendar year with this injured groin? Maybe he sits out like 4, 5, 6 weeks and then comes back after the calendar year. And then we have a like smooth sailing with the concussion problem. Can we both these issues with just a couple weeks on the injury report or like on the sideline?
It's probably not so cut and dry like that. You probably not black and white. But yeah, it was that was a very fair question. That was funny. But what week was that? So he had the hip in week 1. It
was pretty early.
It was a week 11. He got the concussion.
Oh, I thought it was early.
No, and then he had the illness. Remember the illness? That was his post-concussion syndrome.
I thought that was the concussion.
Yeah, it was. No, it was
early in the season. That was like week 4 or something, I thought.
No, it was week 11, 12, and 13.
What? That's absurd.
Mm-hmm. He had the hip in week 1. I'm looking at it right
now. See it?
Yeah.
Maybe you make a point. I can't even remember which injury is which with all the injuries this guy's
right. Up. Exactly. He's on the prove it list, right? He's on the prove it list. He hasn't proved it quite yet.
All right. Okay. So is there a database somewhere that I can tap into that tells me the average time of like days missed per injury, and then also what to expect when the players come back from like a reduced production standpoint? Like, player has a, I don't know, high ankle sprain, expect reduced, 80% production for the next 6 weeks when they return. Is there anything like that out there?
Everybody right now, type this into your phone, your laptop, whatever, www.twitter.com/FBinjuryDoc. And you go there, you click the follow button, and that's where you're going to find my databases. Okay. I have a few databases I'm working on. I have one of them right now, for example, high ankle sprains. That gives you that exact thing that you're looking for. And as it relates, I didn't know you were going to ask me this question, so I'm actually going to filibuster for myself until I can pull this up. But I do have the return to sport stuff for high ankle sprains, specifically for skill players that are coming back from a high ankle sprain in the NFL. It's from 2016 and it goes all the way through 2021. And what we found with these high ankle sprains, can I call you Drew? Drew, I see your email said Andrew. Okay. How do you say your last name?
Ozenchuk.
Ozenchuk. Are you Canadian?
Of course.
Okay. Yeah, I could tell. So what we found from these high ankle sprains, now that I have it pulled up, from 2016 to 2020, what we saw, first of all, is every single time you see, here's how to spot a bad injury analyst. Schefter hasn't tweeted this is going to be a 4 to 6 week high ankle sprain, and an injury analyst will tweet, this is a high ankle sprain. This will be between 4 and 6 weeks recovery. That's how you spot a bad injury analyst. Here's why. There's a 2013 study done, an official NFL study, where they looked at all 32 NFL teams, and the average return to play time for these high ankle sprains was actually 15 days. So I said, I'm going to fact check that. I looked at 2016 through 2020 and looked at the amount of weeks missed because of a high ankle sprain. What we found is that the mean of time missed, lo and behold, 1.8 weeks, 2 weeks. The median, 2 weeks. The mode was actually 3 weeks. The standard deviation was 1.5, right? So basically 2. So what that means for, in plain English, but I'm sure your listeners are used to these statistical, slaps in the faces, is they miss anywhere from 0 to 4 weeks, right? So then you break it down on a case-by-case basis. From 2016 to 2020, skill players missed 14% of skill players missed 0 weeks. 22% missed 1 week. 12% missed 2 weeks. 27% missed 3 weeks, and a combined 21, a combined 26% missed 4 weeks or more. So what you're looking at is, like I said, it's basically between 2 and 4 weeks. That's when these players come back. But on top of that, what you also have to consider is that when these players come back from a high ankle sprain, there is approximately, I wish I could find it, there's approximately an 18% dip in fantasy points per game for these guys. And that's totally legit, because then you go back to that study that I was telling you about in the first place. All 32 team docs in the NFL stated that even though players do come back at 2 weeks, it actually does take that 4 to 6 week mark for players to come back and be themselves. Sometimes they never come back and are themselves. And I mean, Michael Thomas is a perfect example. Earlier, we talked about what injuries am I targeting to take advantage of in season. This is the opposite of that. High ankle sprains are not an injury I'm looking to target unless it's, 5 weeks removed, 6 weeks removed. They're not on the injury report anymore with a high ankle sprain. They don't seem to be performing. maybe I'll throw a line out there. But this is not an injury that I am actively targeting in terms of a high ankle sprains. Like they're just not, they're ugly injuries, and they can end up in a Michael Thomas type situation more frequently than we want to see.
Did you know that Christian Kirk is a bulletproof prospect? And then he was on his way to breaking out, and he got a high ankle sprain and ruined his entire career.
That must have been what it is. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that sounds right. You should publish that. That sounds like a case study.
It's certainly not one of those things where we can't tie any other thing to the explanation for why he has failed out of the league.
Prove that it's not true. Prove that it's not true.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm listening. Go.
I can't.
Okay, so a couple more questions real quick. Denzel Mims, bad salmon. Is that the reason that he sucks?
Yes.
Is there more to it?
No, objectively, there's a salmon. There's a species of salmon. I believe it's called the natives call it the Inturumapa. And when you consume this stuff, no, that's not why he's bad. He's just a bad NFL prospect. He's just bad. Okay.
You're being serious. No. What? This is a joke question. I'm getting a real answer.
This is no. This is not. This was not that. This was not that.
All right.
I don't have that much knowledge about fish, to be honest with you.
Okay, who's your favorite veteran dynasty buy?
Dude, it depends on what ADP you're looking at. But I've been pounding the table for this guy, so it's not even fair. Saquon Barkley is going at the 2.11 on I think it's on fantasy data. He's going at the 2.11. Christian McCaffrey's still going at the 1.01. What other running back on this planet is going to get the passing volume in 2021 and 2022 and is 24 years old? Is superhuman, is Superman. Like the hate on this, I guess this should have been my injury. When you asked me what injury do people overreact to, like this is ridiculous. Like this is not. You should not be falling to the back freaking half of the second round. Like even the biggest Saquon non-believer for 2021 would tell you it's probably a little steep for dynasty. It probably shouldn't be going quite that late. So that I didn't want to say him because to me it's so obvious, but maybe that is why I have to say it. Like that's so obvious to me. Don't let Saquon Barkley fall to the 2.11 in your non-super flex freaking PPR dynasty leagues. Like what the hell?
I can't even imagine which players are going ahead of him because that's so far down the list that I'm like I don't even know.
No, yeah, I closed the window because I was so mad and irate that I don't even have it in front of me anymore.
That's fair. I think I'm there with you. I know nothing about injuries, but I do know he's a very good running back, and I think I think that's enough.
There you go, bulletproof, huh? Yeah, bulletproof logic on that one.
Yeah. Oh yeah. All right, so you've been playing fantasy for a long time, I presume. You played Dynasty for the last how many years? You say 2, 3?
Just a couple.
Years?
2 years. Yep.
What's the biggest thing you learned so far? Your biggest lesson? Why did I do that?
What was that? What would you do?
No, I'm just saying, like, when you had the realization that you have made a grave mistake with your dynasty roster.
One of them is let me start with redraft because this one really irritates me every year. I am a slave to ADP. Like, probably not actually, right? But like in my head, I'm hard on myself about this. Like, I have this compulsive pathological characteristic where if I'm reaching even a little bit, I shut down. I'm not going to do it. I'll go chalk. Like I could be staring at this year, for example, I could be staring at Jerry Jeudy in the 6th, and I don't know who else is going in the 6th round that probably should be going in the 6th round. Who knows? Another player. Think of another player going in the 6th round.
Courtland Sutton probably should be.
I could be looking at both of those dudes, right? I could be looking at both those dudes, and I'll go, okay, I guess I'll go, I don't know. I guess I'll go Courtland Sutton because the ADP says so. And like, it doesn't like, I'm just so bad at this. And then every year there's just one guy in my redraft league every year where I'll watch him draft and he's pretty good. He won the league last year. I'll watch him draft and I'll be like, what a reach. What a reach. Like every 3 rounds or so, I'm like, what a reach. The dude won last year. And I'm looking at his roster again this year. And I'm like, oh, man, that's a stacked effing roster. That's really annoying. So the one thing I've learned is don't be a slave to ADP. Understand the turns and understand which player is likely to make it back to you and which player is not. Understand your draft room, who you're drafting with. Overall, my draft room is not very sharp in my home league, but I do have that one guy and then another guy who are pretty sharp. And you have to account for those guys, especially when you're drafting on opposite ends of the draft. So that's what I know it sounds obvious. I know that's sort of the chalk answer too, but you have to understand that it's okay. Like every now and then reaching is okay, because when you finish, if you balanced yourself enough, like your reaches are going to mitigate, they're going to wash themselves out, and you're going to have a pretty stacked roster. So that's my redraft thing that I've learned. In Dynasty, I'm so bad. I told Graham Barfield the other day, because we started a Dynasty league specifically like for me. I asked him like, hey, can we start a Fantasy Points Dynasty league with some of the subscribers, because I suck and I need more reps. And he's like, oh yeah, let's do it. So we did it. And I texted him the other day and I was like, I'm so bad at this that somebody should call the FBI on me. Like I have this rebuild that just looks trash. Like my number one running back is Tevin Coleman. My number one receiver, I believe, before Jamar Chase, because I got Jamar Chase this year, I think was like Marvin Jones. Bad decisions were made on all accounts. But what I've learned in Dynasty is that the players are sharper, right? That's the first thing I learned. The second thing I learned is that don't look beyond like 2 years. Like don't think I'm going to rebuild this from scratch and it's going to, it's my kids will take over this team. Like, no, like there's a such thing as literally building for this year or building for next year. And like, if you can balance that out, and if you can understand that this is really not that long of a game, like it's a little bit longer than redraft, but understanding that you need to balance out, like you need to be good sooner than you think you do, then that would be the advice that I'd give. I don't even know if that made sense.
I think it does. I want to touch on your redraft thing, because I think that I'm very much like a slave to ADP in Dynasty, because there's so much value to be shifted around, because there's a lot of trades in Dynasty. There aren't a lot of trades in redraft typically. Right. So if you're in a redraft league, you can't just, I'll get that guy in week 4, or I'll get that guy next year, or I'll wait and see if he actually is good, and then I'll go and pay up for him. In redraft, you just got to take your guy. So I'm with you there. Like, yeah, I absolutely. Think people need to realize that. Listen, if that guy ain't going to make it back to you and you want him, you got to take him. Yeah, like, it's going to be a reach, but you have to do it if you believe in the guy. Right. Whereas in Dynasty, I'm like, no. We have so much value on our team, and it's give and take, and we only get one pot of value in the startup draft, and we can't waste it.
We like to think that. I think we like to think that it's all chess, but it's also on a scale. Like I think redraft really is more checkers versus chess. Like the draft, you do have to, pick your spots and be careful, but you have to be pretty aggressive, like you're saying, in redraft, and just go for it and don't worry about balance as much. And I've known that intellectually, but applying it has been the hardest thing. Like just go for value. And like you were saying, like it's not a reach if you want the guy. If you believe he's going to meet up to that ADP or whatever the case may be, then just go do it. A lot of times it's just we outthink ourselves. I think the community's gotten so sharp that we all collectively outthink ourselves and try to sort of put up these barriers to what we want to do, and what we know maybe naturally is probably the like it's a fine move. Like it's going to be okay.
Totally. And the other thing with that redraft thing is like if you're a slave to ADP, you're probably getting the leftovers that nobody else wanted. And in which case you're probably getting the guy that has the really low ceiling that yes, he might outproduce his ADP. You might get the wide receiver 38 that actually finishes at wide receiver 33, but that doesn't win your league. Right. You need to just go and get the guy that might finish wide receiver 12. And if he misses, he finishes wide receiver 48. And the difference between the guy that went 30 or the guy that finished 35 and 48 is very small. But the difference between the guy who finished wide receiver 12 and 35 is enormous. And that's your exactly. So yeah, like high ceiling guys just don't stick around in redraft ADP. Like they get scooped up before their ADP usually. Yep. And then, if you're picking at ADP, you're probably getting the guy that, like the Willie Snead many years ago, where you're like, I don't know, he's probably going to be a wide receiver 3 or 4. And he was a wide receiver 3 or 4. And, I guess.
Congratulations, you didn't reach, right? Like that's what your prize is. Like, okay, you didn't reach. Congrats. Yeah, that's what you get.
Exactly. So anyways, that is a wrap for the show. Thanks for coming on, Edwin. Again, you can find Edwin at fantasypoints.com, and you can also listen to his podcast, the Fantasy pardon me.
What a bad host. Oh my God. What a bad. Yeah. There we go. I'm just kidding. I'm joking.
And you can follow him on Twitter at FB Injury Doc. Am I missing anything, Edwin?
No, you got it, man. I appreciate you having me on. This was fun. This was a good time. You thought of a lot of them. I love impromptu questions, honestly, because it keeps me on my toes. I like it.
Well, they just kept coming up. You'd like say something. I'm like, well, actually, now I have a different question. Ignore the show sheet. We're just freestyling again.
Okay.
Anyway, anyways, audience,
free ball.
Listeners, thanks for coming. See you next time.